All right, everyone, welcome to today's webinar. I have the pleasure of speaking with 10x CEO Jeff Carback as we talk about the topic regarding the biggest reason why growth strategies fail. This is part of the 10x webinar series, and today's topic is specifically going to talk about choosing how to choose which growth strategies that actually work for your business. I'm Dave Scott. I'm the marketing manager here at 10x, and I'm joined by our CEO, Jeff Carback. Just a few items before we get started on the webinar today. This webinar is live and being recorded. So if you're watching the webinar, if you could just shoot us a quick comment in the comment box, that would be great. Just letting us know that our video and audio is coming through all well. And again, this is going to be recorded. So if you have a colleague or friend or a coworker that you want to watch this webinar afterwards, it will be posted on all of our social channels, on our website, and on our company YouTube page as well. Awesome. We've got a couple of comments. Great. Looks like we're coming through all well. Super. So as we dive in today as well, Jeff will be sharing not only a little bit about how the best practices in choosing your growth strategies will actually work, but he'll also share his contact info and his wisdom over a plethora of background, not only in growth strategies, but other services as well. If you have any questions, just shoot them into the question box. It's a little box at the very bottom of the screen here, and you should be able to put your questions in there. We'll get to them at the end of the webinar, unless there's a really urgent one. And if it is urgent, just tell us that, and we'll ask that question of Jeff right away. All that being said, Jeff, take us away.
Great. Thanks very much, Dave, for hosting this important webinar. And thanks everybody for joining. It's really my pleasure, and I'm really excited about the opportunity to talk to everybody about what I think is really the key part of innovation strategy that I think is an important area to focus on, and one that oftentimes organizations miss, and really I think is critical for the overall effectiveness of an innovation strategy. So before we get into this topic about the hard part of innovation, let me just very quickly introduce myself. So I'm Jeff Carback, the CEO of 10x. I've been with the firm for a little over a year, and my background has really been focused on the whole growth and innovation strategy process, but starting from, I think, a sort of unusual, unique perspective. So I started in academia. I was a professor at Princeton, chemical engineering, where as an academic, I started to get really interested in the question of why does it take so long, and why is it so hard for new technologies to make it to market. And that started a journey where we really started to look at the whole innovation process from beginning to end, started thinking of it almost as a supply chain, and trying to understand where some of the bottlenecks are. And of course, this was targeted at innovation around manufacturing and industrial technologies, but really the lessons we've learned are broadly applicable. So based on that interest, I spent several years starting and building my own companies, kind of developing some of these principles around opportunity assessment, and then through that process, built and led the global advanced materials and manufacturing practice at Deloitte Consulting. So a practice very much focused on helping our largest clients with their biggest growth and innovation challenges, again, primarily in the materials and manufacturing sector. Along the way, I also have spent quite a bit of time with the World Economic Forum, because obviously this topic is one that has broader interest than just strictly in the corporate space. And since April of last year, have joined 10x as a CEO, because I think the approach that 10x uses, that we'll talk about just a little bit in the specific context of 10x, really is one that I feel is highly aligned with this rapid innovation process and strategy. And one of the things we've learned over a long period of time in doing this is that innovation typically happens in a series of integrated sprints. So there's sprint number one to identify a long list of ideas, and there's kind of sprint number two to down select and prioritize. There might be sprint number three to really nail what the top few are, and then you take each of those ideas forward sort of in their own cyclical sprints. And there's something sort of inherent to this 3 to 4 week time frame for these different activities that's important, and that's just sort of the natural pace and scale at which 10x works. So I really want to devote the majority of this webinar to the specific insights we have around the hard part of innovation. But I do just want to very quickly mention some very important details about 10x. You can find all of the information at our website, 10x.com. But just for those of you who are maybe less familiar, what's really unique about 10x is that for each project, we custom build a team composed of independent consultants and a significant number of industry experts that are active in that industry or market that we're particularly focused on and helping our clients gain insights. And we manage that process both in terms of the quality, but also in terms of the project flow. And we bring our own experience and expertise and insights into the project. So we are very much involved in all the details of every project. And we do this because in this way because it allows us to structure projects that have that sort of inherent speed and efficiency associated with them that really matches the innovation process. So our typical project span lines up well with those 3 to 4 week sprints that are so common or so necessary in innovation strategy. We do a whole host of, or provide a whole host of different solutions around different dimensions of growth strategy. I won't again go through the details of these because you can look at them at our website, but we do really span that whole process of innovation and growth strategy. What I want to focus today on is really if we break the innovation strategy process down into 3 pieces. The first piece being the one that I think a lot of people associate with innovation, which is you get a bunch of creative, smart people in a room and you generate as many new ideas as you possibly can. And we call this the sort of divergent process. It's the process that results after a few hours of activity, collective activity, and long lists of different ideas, maybe grouped around some themes or some geographies. And usually what it is it's left in the hands of somebody to kind of roll up all of those sheets and say, okay, now I've got these large collection of ideas. What do we do next? And so it turns out that first part of innovation, the innovation process, the brainstorming process, is not the hard part, as we've said. And in fact, both in our own organizations as well as with our clients, time and again, we come onto the scene when that process has already happened. There's already been a long list, and now the question is, well, what do we do next? And that leads to the second part of the process that we're going to focus on the webinar today, which is really about how do I go from this long divergent list down to the few opportunities that are really worth further investing in, and some sort of plan to deal with the rest, because we don't just want to toss them away. We can't follow up with all of them because that would be spread too thin. So we really have to come up with a prioritization and an action plan. And that's really what we're going to talk about today. The third step is really about after we've identified a specific opportunity, how do we really start to further build that out? And we have a process at 10x called opportunity assessment, opportunity hypothesis assessment, that we've talked a little bit about in a prior webinar, and we'll spend more time on in the future. But that's really, now that I've got one opportunity, how do I really kind of start to run it to ground and really identify its characteristics and its features? And that's a little bit beyond the scope of today's conversation. There's also an approach to managing this whole process dynamically. So in other words, in most organizations, you don't have one brainstorming process, one prioritization and selection process, and then you just run things forward. You're constantly refilling the funnel and reactivating that front end divergent process, or maybe at least revisiting many of those ideas that you had looked at in the past and reassessing them. And so this also ultimately becomes a dynamic management process. That dynamic nature will indicate, but we won't go through in this webinar the full details of how we implement that. Because what we really want to focus on is this one step, this going from the long list to going to the few that are worth investing in. And what we often say is that this is the hard part of innovation. And it's hard not because there's not a good process and approach. It's just hard because it requires work, and it really requires looking outside your 4 walls and engaging with experts and industry people who are not typically the people you speak to every day. They're not typically the people you would engage with. So it sort of takes you out of your comfort zone, and really can be really challenging to find and then communicate in the right way with the right people. And this is one of the things that we think we do particularly well at 10X is provide that access to those experts and drive that whole process. But just as importantly, we do it within the context of a very specific process and framework. So let me now step right into that. So in terms of the topics we're going to cover today, I'm going to cover three things. So I'm going to talk about the process and framework specifically around this down selection and prioritization activity. And associated with that, I'm going to talk about the two different types of criteria that we use. So we use what we call an attractiveness criteria and a fit to business criteria. And I'll go into a little bit more detail on those in a minute. And then the last thing we'll talk about is how you actually bring that together in terms of a process. So the key point up front is that without a process and without a framework, a couple of things can happen. So one is nothing happens because we've got this long list of ideas and nobody really knows what to do next. And people can just start, trying to think about different opportunities, but without any sort of process or framework, you quickly get spread too thin. So we've already sort of indicated that need for a process. The second is oftentimes what we find is that ideas get propagated forward, not because they're the best ideas or the best opportunities, but because of the particular individual who's championing them. And this sort of bias of position is really a big challenge for organizations. So somebody who has a particularly significant leadership position or is particularly outspoken, there's a whole host of characteristics that can result in an idea being pushed forward because there's an individual champion that pushes it versus it being the best idea to push forward. And so the other idea behind a process and framework is to take a lot of that bias out. And oftentimes teams actually need some guidance and coaching to achieve that more sort of objective approach, because it can be quite difficult to manage that. So that's another part of what we often provide is just that team direction and guidance and collaboration in getting this process done. So the idea here is that we should be able to take a long list of ideas, and depending on that, the length of that and the diversity and whether we might be able to group those into some sort of sets of topics where we can start to assess them as collections, not just as individual ideas. So based on, say, geography or industry segment, or maybe even topic or need that you're trying to address. A good goal is to go from that long list down to your short list. So typically we say your short list should be 10% of your long list. So if you start with 100, you should get down to 10. That whole process should take 3 to 4 weeks typically to get to that number as sort of as a first phase. And so what we'll do now is we'll step into the criteria that we use to go from that long list ideas down to that prioritized top 10%, that top 10 out of 100, so to speak. And in doing this, what I want to introduce is these two different criteria. And the first criteria is attractiveness, and this is attractiveness to any organization. So it's really independent of the business or the team or the company that's pursuing the opportunity. It's just an overall attractiveness independent of your particular position. And then the second set of criteria is around fit to the business. So that is looking at that opportunity through the specific lens of your business. And we'll dive a little bit more deeply into each of these. The process is one in which, when we're going from the 100 down to the top 10, where we want to choose just a few criteria in each of those buckets to get to that first prioritization, and then we'll develop more criteria. But let me to get to that refinement. But let me step into the first class of criteria then that we use to do this assessment. So as I mentioned, opportunity attractiveness is really an outside-in perspective of an opportunity. So oftentimes it's associated with things like market size, growth, how segmented or consolidated the market is, how easy or difficult it is to enter, what are the fundamental customer needs, what are the fundamental buying behaviors, how does that market segment out. and who are the competitors. And so this assessment is oftentimes quite challenging to do, like I said, because it requires insights and information that you don't typically have in your own day-to-day operations and business. And you probably don't have the people on your team who already have this deep insight. And so, you've got to go find it outside of your organization. And this is really where, we think that 10X can play a key role, not only in the process, but also in the engagement and conducting of engagement with experts to get these kinds of insights. And one of the things that we've found is that you really need to talk to people that are in the industry today, in the market today, because many of these markets are very dynamic and they change on a time scale of months. And so if you're just talking to somebody that used to be in the industry 3 or 5 or whatever years ago and they've now retired, you'll get some high-level insights, but you probably won't really get the key insights that you would need to make these kinds of decisions. The other thing that we think is really important to highlight is some of this information is available in reports, and we sort of take, for example, market size and growth as almost a given that you're going to have that information as you're going into an initial assessment. Or if you don't have it, you can find it in a quite straightforward way using secondary research tools, reading reports, doing some research on the internet and that sort of thing. But what is very difficult oftentimes to identify are some of these other things about how segmented is the market, how easy or difficult is it to enter, who are the key influencers, what influences decision makers to change from one product or service to another. And this is where really talking directly to experts is really essential. As I said, when we go through this first pass, the goal here is to really only choose 2 or 3 attractiveness criteria, perhaps in addition to market size and growth, because that's such an obvious one. But in addition to those, really choose just a couple that we think are going to be the most important when we do the prioritization. So agreeing on and establishing the criteria in and of itself is a critical part of the process. And oftentimes, the way we do this is we develop an initial set of criteria, and then we work very closely with the team that owns the innovation process and strategy to refine that and agree upon it, because that's really the thing that allows us to be objective about looking at different opportunities. So we have to agree on the criteria first. Of course, there's always room for updating or modifying as we learn more, but we really do try and be quite thoughtful and come up with those criteria early on and apply them in a fairly rigorous manner. So once we've done that and we've identified the criteria, and we've then gone out and gotten the insights from this combination of market research and engagement with experts, what we now have is essentially an attractiveness score that we can apply to the long list of ideas, and that's half of the process then for down selecting. The other half is this question of what's the fit with our business. And this is a really interesting set of criteria because they ultimately have to come from the ambition of the team and the business. These are essentially looking at these opportunities, even the attractiveness criteria themselves, through the specific lens of the business that wants to drive growth. And here we're looking at things like how does this fit with our existing customers and channels? How does this fit with our existing capabilities, and what are the gaps and capabilities that we're willing to fill either through internal growth or through mergers and acquisitions? And then it usually has to fit with a few other key strategic objectives that may be about target revenue or profitability. It may be about synergy with another business. It may be about leveraging existing, like I said, market channels or existing capabilities that we think are highly differentiated. Again, the process is twofold. So one is it's coming up with the criteria, developing the few that we think are going to be useful for down selecting the long list, and then looking at those opportunities that we've already assessed through an attractiveness perspective, and now saying, okay, now that we understand how attractive they are, what is the fit to my organization? And after we've done that process, we now have 2 scores for every opportunity. And there are lots of different ways to use that information. What we find is the most useful is to create a very simple plot where we plot fit to the organization on the x-axis and attractiveness, overall attractiveness on the y-axis. and then each opportunity becomes a point on that graph. And of course, what we're looking for are things that are up and to the right. So both high attractiveness score and high fit to the business. Of course, what you typically find is a fairly broad distribution. There will always be sort of the obvious candidates that are you identify quickly, and then there's typically a lot of debate on the margins. And one of the things we do at this stage is we sort of draw a diagonal line where the opportunities that fall along this line either have high attractiveness but marginal fit, or high fit but marginal attractiveness. And these are really interesting cases because oftentimes there might just be one dimension to the opportunity that if something changed either internally or out in the market, that opportunity would suddenly become either both highly attractive and a high fit, or vice versa, depending on what's sort of causing it to be marginal. And so those are opportunities that we may not act on, but we would certainly track in terms of these very specific criteria. So you start to see how this becomes a dynamic process where you continue to track opportunities over time, even if they don't end up in your highest prioritization list. So now we've gone through that exercise. We've essentially taken our long list down to 10, or 10%. And the next phase is essentially another iteration on that process, because the goal is to get to like I said, the 2 or 3 opportunities that are really worth investing in, whether it's building out a more complete business case. It might be about going and doing an M&A scan because you believe the right way to get into that is through acquisitions. There's a whole host of activities, many of which we showed on the earlier slides around our growth initiatives that then come into play, but you only want to make those investments once you've, like I said, down selected. So in the second phase, it's essentially the same process. We go back, but now what we're doing is developing a longer and, more importantly, more refined list of attractiveness and fit criteria. At this point, we usually learn quite a bit about the opportunities that are on the short list now. We also can be a bit more rigorous and in depth because we're looking at fewer overall numbers of opportunities. We've already gained a fair amount of insight because we've already talked to some experts already on these topics. So maybe we already even have some of the data and insights from that first round of interviews and research. And so there's a whole process of sort of identifying what additional things we want to understand, and then going back out and doing that second round of engagements with experts and research to fill out this more complete attractiveness and fit assessment process. But in the end, you do the same thing. You end up with each opportunity having 2 scores, and we look for unique combinations of attractiveness and fit to then select the 2 or 3 that would go forward into a further opportunity development. And like I said, it could be a business case development. It could be a more targeted market assessment, a go-to-market strategy. There's a whole host of different things that can happen. The second step, although there are fewer opportunities because you're going much deeper into some of them, and you may have some questions that take more time or more engagement to answer, also can take roughly 2 to 4 weeks in time. 3 to 4 weeks might be, again, the right number. So it's almost a second sprint cycle to do this further refinement of opportunities. And again, it all depends on the number and how diverse they are in their characteristics. But that sort of gives you a rough sort of rule of thumb about how long these assessments might take. So hopefully that sort of highlights or outlines this intermediate piece of opportunity assessment. And like I said, it is hard work, but fortunately there's a very well-defined process to move through that. And the outcome of that is that you have a fairly good level of confidence, very high level of confidence actually, that the opportunities you've identified are worth investment in. And maybe this is an important point to make here before we open this up for any questions or comments. But when people go into this process, oftentimes there are a couple of sort of failure modes. So I've talked about one of them, which is letting the champion drive the process versus the process run its own course. But there's a couple of other ones. So another one is that the there can be a tendency, especially when you put a lot of analytical, technical people in the room, to overscore and attempt to over numerically optimize, right? So maybe we'll assign 10 criteria for attractiveness and 10 criteria for fit, or maybe we'll actually have 3 buckets, and then we'll run some sort of numerical algorithm to sort of try and find some optimal solution. Our view is that once you go beyond a few criteria for each of these 2 buckets, the precision by which you define them is low enough that you sort of get noise out of that process if you introduce too many criteria that are too poorly defined. So that's one. And the second piece of it is that oftentimes there isn't a single ideal opportunity that's sort of, the killer. You hear about this all the time. Oh, we just need to find the killer app, or we just need to find that one bright, shiny opportunity that's going to, turn this into a $1 billion business. And our experience has been is that you can't make that choice at this stage. And so the objective shouldn't be to find the best opportunity, but it should be to find opportunities that are good enough that justify further investment and some sort of process to continuously refresh that pipeline and reassess things that you've looked at in the past as things change and enter new things into that pipeline. So, really the way to think about this is that we're just trying to drive things to a stage where we can make those decisions about the few that need to have further investment and the many that either are parked or killed or need to be reevaluated. And sort of the motto that perfect is the enemy of good is very, very applicable here. So we really push hard to make sure that it's really reflective of developing opportunities that are robust, understandable, explainable, and worthy of investment. And I think that's a good place for us to conclude at least the presentation part of this webinar. Again, happy to take questions, address comments, and we can also talk about how we can have any sort of further conversations, either about the topic or about how 10X could potentially help your organization with these kinds of activities. So Dave, let me turn it back to you, and maybe you can help us manage that last segment here.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Jeff. That was fantastic. So as we go through, one of the questions we have is from Robert. He asks, as you move through the process and framework phase, the opportunity attractiveness phase, and score those into the fit with business phase, what's the time frame for that entire length? I know you talked about, Jeff, the time frame per each phase of the process, but Robert's asking about what's the entire time frame look like moving all through 3 of those phases?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's probably, the brainstorming process and the divergent sort of gathering of ideas process should be pretty fast. That's usually a couple of weeks. Part of that is just getting schedules together and so forth. And then these sort of 2 iterations of, one is the prioritization, the second is the down selecting. Like I said, there could be some overlap, and there's shared information if they were to be done in total isolation. Each one would probably, like I said, take 3 to 4 weeks each. So there's a couple of points to make on this. So the answer to the question is probably the end-to-end process of having a good divergent brainstorming, or planning a good divergent brainstorming session, to having the 2 or 3 that are worth investing in. That should be a 3-month activity at most, and that's why you run it iteratively. But there's a couple of other points to make about that timing that's really, really important. So there's just an inherent time scale to these activities, and you need a process and an approach that matches that time scale. The inherent time scale really is driven by a couple of things. So one is just the time it takes to figure out the questions you need to ask, find the people you need to speak to, do the research that you need to do, and gather that information, and then communicate it amongst your team members, right? Because you have to sort of bring the whole team along on this journey, right? Not in terms of just the opportunities, but the criteria by which we're going to select them. And then once we start to bring in the information, the actual prioritization process, that activity, because it involves a team and because it involves a fair amount of inter-team communication dynamics, just has a sort of a time constant of weeks that fits very well, I think, with this kind of approach. If you go much faster than that, my bet is that you're glossing over really important insights and information, probably making poor decisions. If it takes longer than that, you're getting probably into this sort of analysis paralysis situation where you're increasing consistently the number of different questions you're asking and the things you're trying to look at. And that's where we sort of get to the point about perfect being the enemy of good or good enough. So I think there's that comment. I think the other thing that's important is and maybe we'll get to this in some of the other questions, but it's about the team itself and how the team is constructed and how the team collaborates and so forth. But let me make sure we've addressed the first question and see if there are any other ones, and then maybe we can talk about some topics like team compensation or composition. Thanks.
I think that definitely answers Robert's question. We had another question from Alan Jeff, and he asks, what's the makeup of the team that should be present as a part of this process? So I'm just assuming or presuming rather that when Alan asked that question, and Alan, feel free to clarify the question too, what's the makeup of senior leadership versus junior leadership, C-level exec team, and certainly how many people do you want it to be? As large as possible? Is it a small intimate group? I guess talk through that for a few minutes, Jeff. That'd be great.
Yeah, so there's a lot that goes into that. I would say that probably the most important dimensions to team are size and diversity. And size for looking at multiple opportunities. The number of people that are involved is going to sort of fluctuate up and down. But I would say the core team is probably a half a dozen to at most 10 people. Anything bigger than that, and it's too difficult to manage. Anything smaller than that, you're not getting enough diversity of perspective. And that gets to the second point about diversity. We think it's really important that your innovation team isn't all marketing people, or isn't all technology people, or all sales people, or all operations people, right? It should be a mix of different backgrounds and positions in the organization. So you want to have as much diversity, both in terms of role as well as position in the team. And the reason you want to have that is it's really not about making sure every single type of expertise is covered. So it's not like, well, this is a marketing question, so the marketing person should handle this, and this is a technical question, the technical person should handle this. That's not it at all. It's actually about that team looking at all of those questions together and challenging each other, and having not segmenting the opportunity early on into sort of traditional roles and responsibilities that are often arise in an organization. It's getting all those people to sit evenly at the table or together at the table, regardless of their seniority or their role, and openly discussing the opportunities. That's really, really key. And there's some key team coaching and dynamics that need to be developed to make that successful. And that's actually one of the things that we also spend time doing is making those processes and those team dynamics work. And usually when we as 10X engage in these activities, the team is a blended team of 10X people and our clients' people. And that's where we see this work most effectively. So when we're going through this process, that single collaborative team is communicating every day or every couple of days as insights are being developed, as well as having more sort of structured team meetings on a weekly basis, as well as work sessions to kind of go through the criteria and the assessment process. So really, really important question about team composition and again, it's getting the right size and the right diversity, and the more diverse in terms of background and seniority, the better, without making the team too large.
That's fantastic. And I love the answer just because I think it, talks about the whole diversity aspect of it, right? And getting, like you said earlier, Jeff, really having the openness and honesty to challenge each other and go through what some of those questions and concerns will be around specific growth strategies. You don't get that with intimate teams. You only get that through diversity. So what I hear you saying is that's really a critical part of the process.
Yeah, absolutely.
So Robert and Alan, unless you two have any other questions, there is not any that showed up after them. So those were two fantastic questions. Again, for anyone who happened to miss the webinar today, this will be recorded, and we'll be not only emailing the link out, but we'll be posting it to our website. our YouTube page, and our social media channels. So keep an eye out on those over the next day or two. Jeff, this has been a great spend of my time. I hope it has been for you. And I know our audience loved it as well. We had good engagement according to the data. So we will bid everybody adieu and let you get back to your day. And Jeff, thanks again for walking us through the value of choosing growth strategies that will actually work.
My pleasure. Thanks, everybody.